It's summertime and the living's easy. So what are you reading? What books are you bringing to the beach? What audiobooks are you listening to on all your fantastic road tripping? What other podcasts are you listening to besides this one? Hi, this is Sara Russell. I'm a relationship coach, dancer, and Taoist. In every episode, I'll be talking about psychedelics, well-being, or the human experience. And this one is on a book that I particularly love, How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. And I'll be talking about 5 things I learned about psychedelics from reading that book. So a friend of mine and I were traveling all over the place, and we decided to check this book out. So we were listening to it on Audible. And I love how mainstream psychedelics are becoming. It's about damn time after all the flack they got in the 70s and whatnot, all of the misaligning and malintent that people were trying to level at psychedelics, because we know how subversive they are, right? How mind expansive they are and what potential they have to do an incredible amount of good. So you know the man don't want that. So the first thing I learned reading this book about psychedelics is about the default mode network and how being on a psychedelic journey is a lot like turning that default mode network off. So here's a quote from the book. The mystical experience may be just what it feels like when you deactivate the brain's default mode network. This can be achieved any number of ways. Through psychedelics and meditation, as Robin Carhart Harris and Judson Brewer have demonstrated, but perhaps also by means of certain breathing exercises like holotropic breathwork. Shout out to all my breathers out there. He didn't say that, I did. Back to the quote. Sensory deprivation, fasting, prayer, overwhelming experiences of awe, extreme sports, near-death experiences, and so on. So the default mode network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, right? Which is this part of your brain that is really active during wakeful restfulness. So it's that when you're kind of zoning out, kind of daydreaming. The default mode network is that part of your brain, right? Most active in that resting wakefulness. And it's active when you're thinking about yourself, so that kind of introspection, when you're thinking about somebody else, also when you're thinking about things in your past or when you're thinking about the future. In other words, all of these categories that are ripe for excessive rumination, things where you can really think about them for a long time in not always the best way. So this kind of obsessive, looping, can't get past it, stuck in a thought that just keeps repeating itself, thinking about yourself, thinking about somebody else, analyzing the past, planning for the future, but not in this bright, happy, I just can't wait to think about that kind of way, but this like stressful, anxious way. And we know that an overactive default mode network can actually contribute to heightened rates of depression, heightened rates of anxiety, because it's this obsessive, heavy thinking. It's what causes us to react instead of respond. It's what causes us to speak without thinking. And so basically, we're all in the water of this cultural conditioning, swimming around in it all the time, being indoctrinated with all these injunctions constantly. And so those tend to be what kick off when default mode network is overactive. And so we're in that status quo conditioning about how we should or should not behave, rather than the kind of expansiveness that psychedelics offer. So deactivation of the default mode network is one of the ways that we can interrupt that kind of rumination, introspective process. It's a way to get out of habituated thinking and not react, but instead respond. And let's face it, like psychedelics are one of the ways that we make friends with the unfamiliar. So rather than it being what we already know, what we've conditioned to believe, what we've patterned ourselves to behave like, it's this way to experience the unknown in a new way. The second thing that I learned about psychedelics from reading Michael Pollan's book is that the paradox is a hallmark of mystical experience. So while you're on a psychedelic journey, you are having more of a dialectical experience, right? Where you're pursuing knowledge and you're knowing and your truths, but you're doing it while you're holding complexity and contradictions and asking questions. So it's not this very linear A plus B equals C. This, then that will create this result. It's this more amorphous, ever-changing ebb and flow, again, where we're stepping into the unknown. And so linear thinking tends to be really dualistic, yes or no, good or bad, right or wrong. But we know that the truth is way more complicated than that, right? If anything's too reductive, too simple, it probably doesn't have all of the truth in it, because the truth is messy and complicated. And when we allow ourselves to be with that messy, complicated truth, we actually allow ourselves to step into our humanity, right? So the psychedelics, if they're, quote, a paradox is a hallmark of the mystical experience. I'm also saying, like, yes, the mystical experience, but also paradox is a hallmark of the human experience. So we allow ourselves to be both human and mystical while we're on the psychedelic journey, because we're holding competing, contradictory truths. When we start treating life like it's really tidy and should have neat, easy answers, we really start limiting ourselves and all of the beautiful complexity that makes us who we are. But if we allow ourselves to change, we allow ourselves to be with our truth, and as Octavia Butler put it, the only lasting truth is change. Something else I learned, number 3, about the psychedelic journey and experience from Michael Pollan is what he refers to as flight instructions. And he gets this from Tony Bossis, who has this mantra, trust and let go. And here's the quote from the book. Go wherever it takes you, he advised. Climb staircases, open doors, explore paths, fly over landscapes. But the most important advice for the journey he offered is to always move toward rather than try to flee anything truly threatening or monstrous you encounter. Look it straight in the eyes. Dig in your heels and ask, what are you doing in my mind? Or what can I learn from you? And I really trust in this process of bringing flowers to your fears and inviting your demons to tea. Our shadows are some of the most resourced, resilient parts of ourselves. Our shadows tend to be our superpowers that have been put on guard duty because at some point we didn't feel safe, or we experienced some kind of harm or some kind of trauma. So these really incredible, resilient resource part of ourselves swooped in to save the day and got put on guard duty. But then it gets a little twisted, right? Because like maybe it worked once, or maybe it did the best that it could, but often those shadow techniques, those things that we're afraid of in ourselves, those shadow parts of ourselves, we created them when we were pretty young, when we didn't have a whole lot of power, when our powerlessness equaled some kind of danger, right? So if you think about a baby, if you don't pick that baby up and give it touch, if you don't feed it, if you don't change it, if you don't take care of it, that baby's powerlessness puts it in an incredibly dangerous position. It relies on people around it to take care of it. And that's when a lot of our ways of coping with what happens to us get really deeply ingrained into our nervous systems, into our survival response, into our safety mechanisms. And so the shadow part of ourselves took over when we didn't actually have a lot of power. But as we grow, as we age, as we learn, we actually acquire a tremendous amount more power. And so then that shadow part of ourselves, it doesn't need to be on guard duty in quite the same way anymore, because we have all of these other powers now. We've got a more developed mind. We've got different bodies that we're moving around in where we can actually feed ourselves and make sure that we can move ourselves to safety. So if that shadow part of yourself, that part like where you're afraid to peek through the keyhole, or you're afraid to look under the bed at these parts of yourself, what if that part of you could actually go and do something else besides protect you or try to keep you safe from harm? What if it could go and be its most beautiful, brightest, most bodacious self out in the world? What would it transform into instead of those monsters lurking in the dark? The fourth thing I learned about psychedelics is about high and low temperature as a learning process. And so this is how machines, computers, and AI learn and solve problems. Quote, a low temperature search, so called because it requires less energy, involves reaching for the most probable or nearest to hand answer, like the one that worked on a similar problem in the past. Lower temperature searches succeed more often than not. A high temperature search requires more energy because it involves reaching for less likely, but possibly more ingenious and creative answers. those found outside the box or of preconception. Drawing on its wealth of experience, the adult mind performs low temperature searches most of the time. Gottnick believes that both the young child, 5 and under, and the adult on a psychedelic journey have a stronger predilection for the high temperature search. In their quest to make sense of things, their minds explore not just the nearby and most likely, but the entire space of possibilities. These high temperature searches might be inefficient, incurring higher rate of error, and requiring more time and mental energy to perform. High temperature searches can yield solutions that are more magical than realistic. Yet there are times when hot searches are the only way to solve a problem, and occasionally they return answers of surpassing beauty and originality. So again, this idea of a low temperature search where you're relying on your past to predict the future in some way. You're relying on a bunch of knowns, what has been. But if we're relying on what has been, you've heard me say this before, you're going to keep creating what has been. You're going to keep creating the same possibilities. And every now and then, we need a magical solution. We need to reach into the limitless possibilities of the unknown to have an unexpected solution, something beyond what we could have imagined in our normal day-to-day, task-minded body. And so the psychedelic journey can open up this possibility for a hot temperature search where all of a sudden our minds are expansive to the possibilities. And that expanded possibilities might just create a solution that creates a possibility that is so much more than the best that you could have even imagined, right? And I have this in my meditation practice where I'll set my intention and I'll give gratitude for what I have and I'll imagine the kind of life that I want. But then I throw it up to the universe, right? And I go, and I trust you. You've known me my entire existence. I'm talking to the universe here. We have a very good relationship, very close. We talk all the time. And I'm going, so how about you do it in the way that you think is best for me? I'm not going to assume that I know everything because I know there are possibilities out there that I haven't even thought of. And I just bet they are so wonderful. I'm going to trust in the mystery of this. And so being on a psychedelic journey allows us to sometimes, again, not always the most realistic, but sometimes these very dreamy, like pulling on our heart's longing, like this future that we wish was possible. It at least makes us aware of other possibilities. All right, and number 5 is something that is near and dear to my heart because part of the tradition of my training comes from the Radical Therapy Collective. The Radical Therapy Collective was a bunch of psychiatrists in Berkeley in the late 60s and early 70s. They were volunteering their time at the Berkeley Health Clinic, specifically the mental wing of the Berkeley Health Clinic, and they were working with people who had experienced serious trauma, including vets with PTSD. And what these radical psychiatrists were working with, psychiatrists who can prescribe pharmaceuticals, is they were going, how often are people's problems actually purely biological, purely chemical, purely something that's wrong with them and their bodies in some way, versus them responding to a sick, insane world with some kind of coping mechanism? Like, how much of this is a survival response to a world that doesn't actually support their highest good or their well-being? And so they were deeply invested in unearthing oppressive systems and teaching people how to fight oppression within the larger cultural context, within their own minds, within their own hearts and bodies, so that they didn't, and I'm, caveat here, and I'm going to say this over and over again. I am all for low effort interventions for people who are experiencing depression and anxiety and other mental health conditions. I believe that pharmaceuticals have their place. And yet, I don't think they're the only solution, and I don't think they're a silver bullet that's going to solve all of the problems. We also need to look at what's happening in the environment. Is that individual actually safe? If we're thinking about Maslow's hierarchy, do they have access to an environment where they can safely sleep? Do they have clean water? Do they have nourishing food? Are they able to be around a community that supports them? Are they constantly in a high stress environment that's holding them down or holding them back or harming them in some way? And so the radical psychiatrists were looking at this. And guess who else was? Timothy Leary. So when Michael Pollan is talking about Timothy Leary and how he would talk about psychedelics and he was saying the things that other people were thinking but knew better than to say in the public sphere, here's the quote from the book. It was one thing to use these drugs to treat the ill and maladjusted. Society will indulge any effort to help the wayward individual conform to its norms. But it's quite another to use them to treat society itself as if it were sick and to turn the ostensibly healthy into wayward individuals. So psychedelics may be one of the balms we can use to heal the harm that society causes. We like to make individuals personally responsible for what's wrong with them. Oh, there's something wrong with you. So then if something's wrong with you, it's your responsibility to fix it, rather than us as a community or us as a culture changing something within the structure in order to support the individuals, rather than making the individuals conform to the structure. So we would absolutely, as a culture, as oppressive systems, treat individuals as bad or sick or weak or ill or crazy in some way, rather than acknowledge maybe it's these oppressive systems that are actually making us have very biological survival responses in order to adapt to this environment that's not necessarily working for us. So psychedelics, as well as radical coaching, helps empower individuals rather than teaching them how to adapt to oppression, like so much of the conventional treatments out there, whether that's conventional therapy or conventional pharmaceuticals. And again, all of those things have their place, but you have to be careful, because often they're trying to teach people how to adapt to oppression rather than empower themselves to recognize their powerlessness, to recognize where they do have power, so they can start making changes in their life, so that psychedelics can show us another world is possible. And then if we're able to dream it, we can create it. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps me continue creating content. And if you would like to sign up for our newsletter, you can go to trendswithbenefits.com. We release a weekly newsletter that has all kinds of goodies for you: podcasts, articles, recipes to try to make your life a little bit brighter, a little bit shinier. You can also read some of my articles there. My fellow co-host for Trends with Benefits, Kyle, has worked there, as well as a bunch of other wonderful creators. And y'all, it would help me out so much if you would record a 1 to 2 minute voice memo about how much you love this podcast and send it to podcast@mudwtr.com. That would really help me out. And also, if you'd like some free coaching, just a little quickie on the fly, you can also record a voice memo and talk about what's going on in your relationship and what you have questions about, what you need support about. And you can also email that to podcast@mudwtr.com. Happy journeying.